I'm CJ DeLeo.
And I'm Micah Richards.
And this is the View Now Weekly Politicast. So this week we're going to be talking about Pete Buttigieg. I think I'm finally pronouncing that right.
Yes.
So Buttigieg, the reason we're talking about him, for anyone who's not familiar with him, for anyone who hasn't been following the campaign season, I'm sure most of the people listening to this rely on us for that news. So, the fact that we haven't covered him too deeply is probably a bit alarming for some people.
Mm-hmm.
So Buttigieg is a really pretty interesting new figure in Democratic politics. So he's been on the campaign trail for a while. I think he announced during the main swing when a bunch of bigger named candidates around the same time as Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Kristen Gillibrand, to name a few. So he's been in the race for at least a couple months at this point. And he's really starting to gain popularity. I don't know what the initial cause of that was, if it's just media propping him up or if he's just doing more interviews, if people are just, liking him as this young, new candidate. I mean, we'll get into the actual specifics, but what do you think is leading to his popularity?
Well, if it's okay with you, I'd like to talk about what I like about him first, and that kind of, blends in with what makes him popular, and then later on we can kind of go into the issues I have with him. So to start off with, to answer your question, I think his popularity comes from the fact that he has a lot of personality traits that can appeal to a lot of different groups of people. And I think that is what makes him interesting in the sense that he's openly Christian, he's openly gay, he's incredibly intelligent. He went to Harvard on a Rhodes Scholarship. He is a formal naval officer. I mean, he was the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, so...
Well, still is the mayor of South Bend. But
yes, sorry. Yeah, he's serving his last term currently. And I think for that reason, it's harder to find a reason to criticize him because he, like I said, he appeals to all these different bases, and I think the American people are looking for a fresh face, and not only is he a fresh face, but he's, like I said, an intelligent one as well. And
right. No, I think that's all worth mentioning. I think on an identity level, a lot of Democratic voters could get behind him. I think even more moderate voters, more of the Dixiecrat wing of the party, more of the old-fashioned wing of the party, could get behind those, traditional Christian values that he seems to espouse.
Yes.
So it is interesting to see. I know he was on Stephen Colbert a while back talking about how he is basically the polar opposite of Donald Trump because he is this young, gay, just all-around intelligent guy.
Right.
So I think on an identity level, he's got a lot going for him. I can definitely see why he's sort of gained that popularity. But, I think you probably have a fair amount of issues with him. I know I do.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the first thing that really bugs me, which I'm sure you're probably going to bring this up too, he doesn't like to talk about policy. He really has not made policy a centerpiece of his campaign. And I think that's really just troublesome for Democratic voters, both for Democratic voters and for candidates.
Right.
And we've seen that with a lot of Democratic candidates.
Yeah, you're right. And I know we've talked about this on the show before, how the Democratic Party in general seems to not be as policy-driven as it should be, and I think that that's hurting us. But you're right. Even someone as intelligent as Buttigieg, just does not discuss policy, and neither does the mainstream media, and they don't even necessarily seem to want him to. It's not like anyone from the mainstream media is criticizing his lack of policy. They're happy to pump out these articles about how he speaks 7 languages, and he used that to translate some poor Persian woman's who couldn't communicate with people, or he married the couple who was giving birth at that very moment. They wanted to be married when they had their child, and these are just
Great
absolute
stories.
Dynamite stories for the media. But, like they said on the Young Turks, who cares? These are great stories, and I don't think anyone's debating the fact that he's a bad person or, debating that he's a good person. But at the same time, I don't know why I should vote for him as a politician. And
Right.
like you said, I still know very few of his policies, and the ones that I do know, I don't like.
So, I mean, again, I couldn't name a single Buttigieg political position if you asked me, because he really hasn't made it a centerpiece of his campaign. So I think the one thing that is worth mentioning, and again, this is just another vague thing that he said that probably he just said for the sake of getting support. I don't know if you saw this because it's a couple weeks old already, and I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but Google this if you want to learn more.
Right.
He essentially said that the Democratic Party's biggest problem is that they don't have a unified philosophy, which is a fair criticism. But he also went on to say that it should be less about policy; it should be more about forming that philosophy. Which, again, he could make a great political theorist, but, as a politician, that's not the best mindset to have.
No, it's not. But I think that he does point out an important distinction between the Democratic and the Republican Party, which is that the Republicans are much more likely to fall in line and bend over for any candidate that is pushed upon them, whereas the Democrats will argue morals, will argue voting history, and we get so bogged down in the details that we end up not being able to unite on one candidate. And the problem with the Democratic Party, and this is a problem with the Republican Party as well, but during these critical moments that lead up to the primary in which all of these Democratic candidates viciously attack each other, or not so viciously, but they still attack each other, and then weeks later have to turn around and support each other, it's very difficult to take them seriously.
I mean, it is worth mentioning that you look at the last primary process when Hillary and Trump both officially won their party's nominations. The Republican base did rally behind Trump, even those who were like largely outwardly against him on the campaign trail stood in line, fell behind him. One could argue that what lost Hillary the presidency is the fact that the Democratic base was less evenly swayed. It was less of a response to there was less of a response for uniformity. There was less of a response for the more progressive wing of the party to rally behind her. We thought we could do better, and
I know Democrats who voted for Trump because they were so certain that he was going to lose, and they had a guilty conscience about voting for Hillary because they couldn't support her either.
Well, yeah, I mean, I traditionally vote Democratic, but of course I voted third party in the last election strictly. Well, I shouldn't say the last election because we've had the midterm since then, but I did vote third party in the 2016 election largely because of that divide.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people did. And, there are people who say that ended up splitting the vote. I don't think that there's any legitimacy to that. But voting your conscience is as it seems to me, a more leftist ideology than it is
absolutely.
on the right.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, an interesting way to look at things. There really isn't a mainstream third party for the right. Like, the Libertarian Party is very much a mix of liberal and conservative ideas. So I don't see that as being a viable, I don't see that as being the Republican alternative,
Right.
Whereas the Green Party is, by all means, a progressive wing. It says a lot of the same things that the progressive left is saying.
Right.
Jill Stein was basically identical in policy to Bernie Sanders.
Yeah. Could we talk about progressivism, because I feel like that's a great segue into what I don't like about Buttigieg.
Well, I do want to say before we go on, and we can talk about progressivism. I think there's a lot to discuss there. Buttigieg does consider himself to be progressive, and a lot of the mainstream media, a lot of people in the mainstream media consider him to be either a progressive or having some progressive ideals. But I see him as being a lot like Beto, where you can't really peg him in one side of the party or the other strictly because he doesn't really have enough of a record for anyone to really peg him in any sort of position.
And I think that it's important to distinguish between liberalism and progressivism, because I will not argue about Buttigieg being a liberal. I absolutely would say that he is. But progressivism is more than that. It's realizing that the status quo is just completely unacceptable, and it's realizing that we need to change those foundations in order to move ourselves further. Liberalism very much relies on the foundations of capitalism, which Buttigieg praises. And don't get me wrong, I have nothing against capitalism, but I think that when we prioritize capitalism over democracy, then it becomes an issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of sounding a lot like, Andrew Yang's talking points. It's sounding a lot like Bernie Sanders' talking points when you get into progressivism.
Yes.
And obviously those are two, drastically different examples, but I think it goes to show that the progressive movement isn't one-sided. There is a lot of different schools of thought in that movement.
Absolutely.
Which, I'm sure some people in the establishment media, some people in the establishment Democratic camp would see an issue with. But, it is worth discussing these issues. It is worth mentioning that Buttigieg really doesn't fit into that
Right.
description.
And I think it's the biggest criticism of the media that I see is that they lean left, and even though Buttigieg is a left-leaning candidate, and I always expect them to prop up left-leaning candidates, the left is not synonymous with progressivism, and the mainstream media is absolutely not progressive. I've said that before, and I'll say it again.
And you're absolutely right. And I think that's a mistake that people on the right tend to make about people on the left, progressives, the mainstream media as a whole. The fact is, a lot of us do not agree. A lot of us who are progressives, self-identified, a lot of us who are liberals, self-identified, really don't agree with what the mainstream media is saying in terms of their message, in terms of what candidates they do prop up. It seems like in the wake of the Biden scandal, especially, they're starting to give Buttigieg more of a platform. And I think that did precede Biden a little bit, but it's strange to see this all coming now.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the Biden incident definitely was a catalyst in Buttigieg's sudden surge in popularity. It seemed gradual for a while, but this past week really has. I've been seeing his name constantly,
Right.
And I know that part of it might be the fact that he's been directly making comments towards Mike Pence, basically saying that. And I think he looks at it like this. We all know, especially Buttigieg, that Donald Trump is morally bankrupt, lost cause in every sense of the word. However, Mike Pence, who has been relatively silent throughout most of the presidency, is said to be, this superior moral being that always tries to do the right thing, yet turns a blind eye towards Trump's actions. So rather than attacking Trump, Buttigieg has made Pence his target, and Pence is not happy about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's abundantly clear. Pence, throughout his entire career, has sort of cultivated this image as being the ideal Christian candidate. He's very much a symbolic figure for the religious right. So, for him to be on the sidelines, for him to be the second in command of the Trump presidency, I think is it's interesting to look at for sure. It's a strange pairing for sure. That being said, I mean, a lot of the religious right have banded behind Trump. They see there are people on the religious right who see him as being like the savior, who see him as being the Jesus. I don't know what you call that.
No, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, and they're willing to ignore all of his misdeeds because of what he's done for abortion or some other policy that they cite that somehow covers up all of his disgusting actions. My father being one of these people who believes that no matter what Trump does, as long as his policies leave some kind of Christian fundamental lasting effect, then they're willing to turn a blind eye to everything that he does wrong.
Yeah, I think that's pretty evident. The fact is, Buttigieg strikes me as being, a similar level of religiosity to Mike Pence. Just, obviously he has a very different outlook. That religion influences him in a very different way. Without getting too deep into what their actual beliefs are, I know Mike Pence actually did criticize Buttigieg's statements. He came out earlier today, actually. Basically, Pence believes and has said that he thinks Buttigieg is specifically attacking him and his faith strictly for political reasons, strictly to gain more of a platform.
Right.
Which, there's probably some truth to, but,
there might be some truth to it, but when Buttigieg says that Mike Pence knows better than to stand by and watch this happen, he's 100% right, and I don't see Pence telling him he's wrong on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really all I have to say off the top of my head. That's all the talking points I had covered. Did you have anything else about Buttigieg specifically? Or
I would like to. Well, you mentioned the Christian right, and that's essentially what we believe that most Christians would follow is the right. I think that more often than not, fundamental Christian values dictate the right far more than they ever will the left. But now we have this one face who's representing the Christian left, and I think it's really throwing a wrench in the works, and I think it's confusing people as well because this is something we haven't really seen before.
Yeah, I mean, people do forget. For the longest time, Christianity was a leftist religion. It was like Jimmy Carter was widely considered to be the most religious candidate we've ever had in office for the longest time. Bill Clinton continued that to some extent, but it really switched from being it was a bipartisan thing for the longest time after Carter. Reagan's, I think, changed it a little bit, even though he wasn't the most religious. Bush was the one who really shifted the conversation to the Christianity being associated with the Republican Party.
Bush Senior?
Bush Jr.
Okay.
So this was during the first Bush's administration, and I feel like they probably talked about this a little bit in Vice, but I know Karl Rove really dug home the abortion position. And that was becoming a partisan issue for the longest time. That was becoming a right issue for the longest time. But he basically dug his heels in. He really motivated and really mobilized support of the religious right, especially in the Deep South. And really, a large reason as to why we see religiosity on the right as being, religiosity on the right is because of those movements. And I think it really has spiraled to where it is now, to the point that it is essentially confirmation bias, to the point that it is cognitive dissonance, where these people really will stand by the Republican Party no matter what, even if it does go against pretty much everything they stand by.
Right.
On a individual basis.
And I think it's interesting that you mentioned abortion, because other than not believing in abortion, I see very little evidence that the right represents Christians in any way. But they convince everyone that abortion is such a fundamental issue that that it's so evil and disgusting that people who believe that these fetuses are living human beings, they see abortion as murder. They've been convinced through years of propaganda that abortion is literal murder, and then they have to reconcile. Okay, do I vote for the candidate who represents a lot of good things for this country but believes in murder, or do I go for the candidate who says I want to stop murder? Well, obviously, when your beliefs are that extreme, then you're probably always going to vote for the candidate who says he's going to stop the murder of innocent babies.
And yeah, unfortunately, that is the way a lot of people think. Even outside of abortion, people do often, there often are a lot of single-issue voters. There often are a lot of voters on the left and the right who will strictly support a candidate because of their beliefs on one issue. Buttigieg, I actually don't know what his stance is on abortion. It wouldn't shock me if he was pro-life. I obviously he is this young Democrat, but it's really, I think, difficult for a lot of Christians to sort of disassociate that with their belief system. So I could see him being pro-choice as a progressive. I could see him being pro-life as a Christian. It's going to be interesting to see how he reconciles that, and if he's approached with that question, how he would answer that.
I'm curious about that as well. I honestly don't know, and I should have looked it up, but I'm also curious about how he reconciles homosexual marriage, being a Christian, because it's not to say that the Bible can't be interpreted in other ways, and it's definitely, I'm not saying that homosexuals can't be Christians, but the reality of it is that a majority of Christians overwhelmingly believe that gay marriage is a sin. Does Buttigieg believe this? Does he interpret it differently? I'm curious to see how he reconciles those two identities.
I mean, that's a problem I have with a lot of modern Christianity. Not to say all Christians are hypocrites or anything like that, but there is, there are a lot of old-fashioned beliefs of Christianity that have sort of faded into obscurity, to the point that it is sort of absurd to believe some of the things that are literally stated in the Bible.
Right.
And, it's interesting to see how people reconcile this, how people see this as being symbolism rather than a literal interpretation. Buttigieg, especially as this new voice in progressive politics, if you want to call him that, it would be interesting to see how he reconciles these beliefs.
Right. And I wonder if we could just wrap up by doing a little side-by-side comparison of some of Bernie's issues versus Buttigieg.
Sure.
I know that this week was a big week for Medicare for All. Bernie came out with a very extensive plan that details budgetary issues. It really kind of addresses a lot of the criticisms that people have brought against Sanders, but at the same time, a lot of other Democratic candidates came out this week and said that they support Sanders' plan. However, as far as I know, Buttigieg does not support Medicare for all.
Right.
He does believe that health care is a right, but he structures it completely differently, and I don't see his plan being viable. And I think that Sanders is far and away the best candidate for an issue like healthcare.
I think it's worth mentioning Medicare for All. Just universal healthcare as a general rule has become so overwhelmingly popular both with the left and the right that it would be foolish for any Democrat currently running for the presidency to be against those policies.
Right.
It's not to say it's like political suicide, but it's adjacent to that for sure.
I agree.
And, I don't know exactly what Buttigieg's plan is. I didn't know he said anything about healthcare at this point. Again, I followed him on Twitter the other day. I haven't seen him tweet a single thing about policy in that time. Bernie obviously has been crystal clear on this from day one. But it sounds to me like Buttigieg is more like Beto, and I know we mentioned this earlier, in that I know Beto's whole plan was basically Medicare for some.
Right,
like
exactly.
It's basically an extension of Obamacare, and that sounds to me like what Buttigieg is for as well.
Right, and don't get me wrong, at the time I think Obamacare was a good first step, but I think
Absolutely.
we're way past it now, and it's ridiculous that certain Democratic candidates, especially Beto, which I think Buttigieg has essentially taken Beto's place. I think Beto, like you said, is going to fade into obscurity.
It already seems like Beto's losing popularity. Yeah. I haven't checked the polls too carefully to see where Beto's at. As far as I can tell, he hasn't outwardly lost support, but he's definitely not the media's all-star anymore. He's definitely a little more obscure of a candidate than he was a month ago.
Right, and in Iowa, as you know, is
right.
One
I know.
of the most important
I've
polls.
seen some of the most recent polls, and that Biden's still at the top. Bernie's at a close second.
Buttigieg is in third now.
That's what I've seen.
Which is pretty surprising. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, I think he was polling like 2.3% or something
he
like
was.
that.
Well, he was below Andrew Yang for the longest time.
Right.
Who now is at 3%, by the way.
Okay.
So again, there's an interesting guy who we could talk about in the future. I don't know if we actually talked about him that much in the past, but Andrew Yang is another just interesting progressive voice. So again, it's shaping up to be a increasingly more interesting race. I think we've gotten 2 more Democrats since like the last time we recorded. So
yeah.
It's insane to see that it is still building. There are still people throwing their hats in the ring.
I don't know why they're still throwing their hats in the ring.
It's not like they're even going to split the vote at this point. They're just so unknown. There's so many unknown candidates in this race who have no chance at winning.
Did you see Swalwell's announcement?
I heard about it, yeah.
It was just, it almost made me gag. It was just so coordinated. And he calls his mom on live television to tell her that he's running for president. I mean, dude, nobody cares that you're running for president. Nobody wants you to run for president.
I mean, his mom might, but
right?
Aside from that, no, I don't think.
And then just one last thing about Buttigieg, and then we can wrap this up. He does not support college education for all either, and I think that is one of the things that initially made me very interested in Sanders. Is we have so much data that suggests that a college education makes a world of difference in terms of lifetime feelings of happiness, feelings of achievement, not only just feelings, but also, you make more money over an extended period of time. And to not want to give more people a college education, I think is a foolish mistake.
Yeah. So, it is worth mentioning that, it doesn't poll as well as Medicare for All, but, I think the idea of universal education, tuition-free college education is still relatively new. It's still seen as relatively radical. As far as I know, Bernie Sanders was the first major candidate to actually bring up universal education as an issue. So it doesn't surprise me too much that Buttigieg has been silent on it, or has outwardly disowned it.
Right.
Yes. It's definitely not reached the level of popularity as some of the other major progressive standpoints.
Which just brings me back to my point that I don't believe he's a true progressive.
Right. No, I think he is very much a calculated politician. I think he is saying a lot of what he says for the sake of gaining support.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested to see what happens.
Yeah, without a doubt. Okay, so unless you have anything else to say, I think here's a good place to cut it.
Yeah, let's wrap it up.
Okay, so this has been the BU Now Weekly Politicast. I'm CJ.
I'm Micah.
And thanks for listening.